It's important to notice that in the gun control march, they always talk about the next individual step, never the end destination. It's always about what to do next. It's not about what the final goal is. And as soon as one step is completed, there's never a hand wiping and a declaration that we finally got it done. We finally reached enough gun control. Instead, it's always right on to another thing that we have to do next. Think of all the steps in just the last year. Biden directed the ATF to crack down on so-called ghost guns or incomplete gun parts you have to mill and assemble yourself to manufacture your own gun, a right Americans have always enjoyed throughout the entirety of our history. It was a supposedly huge move with a White House Rose Garden announcement that actually did nothing. It just means you have to buy the frames separately from the jig and the drill bits now. The frames themselves are still readily available for unregulated sale because they are, in fact, just pieces of plastic, as a matter of both reality and federal law. Over the summer, Biden signed a bill to create super-duper extra serious background checks for gun purchasers under 21, plus a scheme to take our tax dollars to bait the states into doing the feds' dirty work of Second Amendment infringement for them. Here, have a big check for red flag laws so we can get a court order to seize property without a criminal conviction. And that gets celebrated for all of 5 seconds until the next shooting when they just throw it in the trash because it, too, clearly was not enough. At this very moment, the ATF is finalizing a new rule that could criminalize millions of gun owners overnight for the possession of their pistol braces that the ATF said for years were fine, but now they've decided constitute a stock, making those guns a heavily regulated short-barreled rifle. No change in any law, of course, just a change in ATF opinion. It's a decision based on whim, not based on rule of law. And should you dare defy it by keeping your property that you legally owned yesterday, you'll potentially face a decade in prison or a $250,000 fine for it. Unclear if that's actually going to happen, but even if it does, will we finally get the hand wiping? Will we finally get the declaration of satisfaction that after all of these steps, we finally did it? We have finally reached the right amount of gun control. Of course not. The destination is never mentioned because the destination is total disarmament and total helplessness before your government superiors. And I'm not just saying that based on alarmist speculation. I am saying that based on listening to these people talk. The president simultaneously brags about his gun control accomplishments while calling for still more, even more restrictive gun control moves. Just last week, he said we should all feel societal guilt for Sandy Hook, as though if you want to be able to defend your family and your community against such a senseless attack, you are actually responsible for it. And the only way to atone for your guilt is to surrender your rights to defend your family and your community to him. Because after all, there is no social redeeming value to the tools you might use for that defense. This was the president over the Thanksgiving holiday. And if you argue otherwise, you aren't just wrong, you're actually ill.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick. It has no social redeeming value. Zero, none.
Now, in fairness, like a lot of things this president says, it's unclear if he actually means no value to any semi-auto gun at all, which of course would mean nearly all modern guns. In context, he's talking about the black, scary-looking ones he calls assault weapons. But if I'm supposed to believe that this guy will suddenly protect your right to a Glock with a newfound passion that he doesn't apply to rifles, well, then I might actually be mentally ill. But to argue against him, to argue for the social redeeming value of the armed citizen, we don't need theory. We don't need hypotheticals or possible scenarios. We just have to pay attention to the news a layer below the sources that parrot his talking points, because the value he denies is actually demonstrated every single day. In Arizona, a demonstration of that value happened just last week. An armed worker stopping a shooting at a warehouse and local police praising him as a good Samaritan for it. The irony, of course, being if this guy takes Biden's advice and surrenders his semi-auto instead, the shooting continues and the damage is likely much more severe. It happened Wednesday in Chandler, a southeastern Phoenix suburb, at an Amazon warehouse. 29-year-old Jacob Murray drove to the back of the employee parking lot, jumped out of his car, and opened fire. He hit one worker several times, but immediately, another armed Amazon contract worker engaged the shooter and ended the threat. That second worker stopped the attack and rendered aid to the victim, who did survive. Actions praised by the Chandler police.
He did come to the aid of an individual who was being shot by our suspect. So in that case, I would say he is a good Samaritan.
The attacker did not survive, though, reportedly due to the gunshots from the armed worker who intervened, which apparently led to a self-inflicted gunshot. Though all three men involved were strangers to each other, there was indirect association between the attacker and the victim. The attacker's girlfriend also works at this Amazon facility. She apparently had some sort of relationship with the victim, unclear exactly what sort of relationship, but that created jealousy for the attacker on which he acted. So it sounds like something targeted, not necessarily a mass shooting or the shooting of random people. Who knows what would or would not have happened if not for the armed good guys' intervention, but the point is, that is a question we should be thankful not to have answered. If you want social redeeming value, how about wondering how many people this guy planned to kill instead of helplessly watching it happen? So we don't need theoretical speculation about the value of self-defense preparedness. This episode is yet another demonstration. Likewise, we don't need theoretical dismissal of the policy alternative either. That too was tested in this case. The idea of just get rid of the guns failed.
Weapons clearly are not allowed. As you pull up to the building, you see, along with the no trespassing sign, a no weapons sign as well.
So clearly it's the sign that has no social redeeming value, yet more signs is the policy that we must embrace to be good, guilt-free citizens. If evil obeyed signs, well, then it wouldn't be evil. But since it is, there is indeed some wisdom to having a more forceful plan B. No word that I've seen yet on whether this Amazon contract worker who stopped the threat will face punishment for his disobedience of the sign. That would, of course, be a preposterous irony, but perfectly fitting in the preposterously ironic world in which we live, so perhaps that'll happen. And the president and the gun grabbers, of course, will never even talk about this case, but if they were forced to, they would dismiss it and say that it's a rarity. It's an anomaly. It's effectively a never event. It does happen, but on balance, compared to gun crime, it's not worth the costs that gun ownership creates. But on that point too, there is a pile of data to the contrary, and so new emails reveal the activists and the bureaucrats have started the work of deleting data they don't like. Uncommonly cited, though always present over at the CDC, are findings from the agency in 2013 that concluded that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive gun use by criminals, with estimates from several surveys ranging from 500,000 to more than 3 million cases per year. These numbers in comparison to about 300,000 violent crimes committed with guns per year in 2008. And of course, the data are over a decade old now, so it stands to reason current numbers are higher. Part of the evidence to reach that conclusion was a paper by Florida State University professor Gary Kleck, which concluded, based on a review of CDC surveys from the 90s, that there are up to 2.5 million defensive gun uses nationally per year. Based on that number, the CDC posted on a gun violence facts page on their website that defensive gun uses could be as high as 2.5 million a year. But since that data point is inconvenient to the gun grabber agenda, the activists lobbied the CDC to remove it, and their friends at the CDC obliged. According to several emails obtained by Stephen Gutowski at The Reload, in September 2021, Mark Bryant, who runs the Gun Violence Archive, the internet database that is commonly cited for mass shooting numbers, emailed CDC officials saying, quote, that 2.5 million number needs to be killed, buried, dug up, killed again, and buried again. This after a meeting between activists and CDC officials was arranged through Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois. Bryant continues, that figure, quote, is highly misleading, is used out of context, and I honestly believe it has zero value. even as an outlier point in honest defensive gun use discussions. Notice the repeat strategy of just declaring that something has no value. It's automatically so. It shouldn't be up to you to decide if the study has value or not. The activists should decide that for you. The CDC briefly pushed back on the attempt to scrub the study, but surrendered after some modest persistence. A CDC policy director replied in December last year, quote, "We are planning to update the fact sheet in early 2022 after the release of some new data. We will also make some edits to the content we discussed, and I think it will address the concerns that you and your partners have raised." And poof. Now the fact sheet on the CDC website reads that defensive gun use estimates vary. And really, since the definitions are so broad and inconsistent and the cases are so hard to identify, we can't actually give you a number, and additional research is necessary to even begin to address that question. Though, of course, we won't be doing any of that additional research ourselves, but still, please give us a bigger budget of your money. Also notable in the decision to scrub the information is the CDC never reached out to that study author, Gary Kleck, to see if he had any counterpoints to the activists. Kleck says the CDC's removal of his study is blatant censorship, evidence of the politicization of the agency. And a big irony in this story is that if you'd like to learn more about the frequency of defensive gun use, you don't have to trust only Gary Kleck, the author of this forbidden study. You can look at the information gathered by the Gun Violence Archive itself. The organization is almost always the source cited when you hear a news story say that there have been 250 bajillion mass shootings this year based on questionable methods and definitions that tend to scoop up a bunch of gang incidents, but that's only part of the website. There's an additional database cataloging defensive gun use cases with all of the stories cited. According to GVA's accounting, even their presumably more proper, more restrictive methods of identifying defensive gun uses show over 1,100 cases just this year, as in social redeeming value demonstrated on average multiple times every single day. And of course, these are stories documented in news coverage. If it doesn't make the news, well, then it's not in the count. So it's fair to speculate there are plenty of those undetected cases as well. And even this more restrictive count of defensive gun use is higher than their inflated count of mass shootings, nearly double, actually. And yes, it is smaller than their count of firearm homicides at close to 20,000, but some things to note. Their count of homicides includes defensive gun use itself and other forms of justified homicide. Murder is only a subgroup. And the idea that you should exercise your rights or not, or that you only hold those rights or not based on these numbers, is a fallacy anyway. In other words, even if it is true that there are more murders or more suicides per year than defensive gun uses, does that make you unwise to want to protect yourself anyway? Or do these numbers justify somebody else stripping you of that right to decide for yourself? Because if evil confronts you, the last thing on your mind will be the statistical methods and findings about whether this sort of event is actually common or not. What will be on your mind is how to stop the immediate threat to your life. If you're helpless before a crazy person, you won't be feeling thankful that actually this is okay, because after all, it's statistically unlikely that I'd successfully defend myself anyway. You will be praying to God for a 0.1% chance over the current zero that you're experiencing. And the tyrants and the grabbers know this. They know that if you see too many examples of other people successfully exercising the 0.1% chance to defend themselves and their families, you might decide that you'd like that same chance for yourself and tell them to come and take it. Like always, this isn't actually a debate about numbers, about what's more common, crimes committed with guns or people defending themselves with guns. It's a debate about whether you should get to decide for yourself how to handle that situation. When they say there is no social redeeming value, they aren't just talking about the gun. They are talking about you making decisions for yourself. Because after all, there's lots of property out there in which I personally see no value. That's why I don't own it or try to buy it. But that lack of appreciation does not entitle me to go to the people who do own it and try to steal it from them or try to steal their right to acquire it if they want to. Besides, this isn't just a question of how you value your property anyway. This is a question of how you value your life itself. How will you protect it is a question best answered by you. Because no matter how flowery these politicians speak, they will never value your life and your family as much as you do. Anybody who tells you that they care more or they care better about you and your family than you do, and therefore they can protect you better than you can, that is a snake and a con artist. You want to talk about backward or absent values? Outsourcing your family's safety to some DC bureaucrat 1,000 miles away who won't even laugh at your call for help because they won't even answer it in the first place. That is the actual void of social redemption. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.